President Obama meets China's Premier Wen Jiabao right here in New York today, and the two are expected to talk about their huge differences on trade policy and the Yuan. Joining us now is Bob Kapp. He is the former president of the U.S.-China Business Council. He runs his own consulting firm focused on China, and Bob is joining us now from Washington. Bob, thanks so much for joining us. We're glad to have somebody with your perspective and your experience with us this morning. We know these UN meetings in September are routine. We know they are time limited, but this has to be a more charged discussion between the two world leaders than perhaps in other times, right?
Well, Deirdre, thanks for having me. Yes, because the U.S. Congress, the House in particular, is at the edge, apparently, of passing legislation which, if it ever went into effect, would throw U.S. trade sanctions on China for allegedly manipulating its currency, keeping the Chinese currency cheap against the dollar, and thus making Chinese exports to the U.S. artificially cheap. The House is just apparently about to take that action, and that lends a particular urgency to this. We're in the middle of an election season, and there's a lot of anger out there, as we know. So that may be on the president's agenda with Premier Wen Jiabao, but heaven knows the U.S. and China have a vast agenda of other issues, on some of which they cooperate and need to cooperate very carefully. I think some of those will come up as well.
Bob, I want to get to those in a minute, but I just want to pick up on what you said. I mean, Chuck Schumer is calling for a 20% appreciation of the yuan. That doesn't seem likely. Is there any chance that Wen Jiabao and President Obama actually get anything done or actually agree to anything that's going to serve as a foundation for future progress, or is it just going to be posturing basically by the two sides?
Well, I wouldn't, posturing is one of those words, but in fact, it's unlikely that the two men are going to come out of the meeting room and shake hands and say, we've agreed on an X% rise in the RMB. The Chinese are allergic to being told in high visibility settings what to do, and they're not going to say, in my view, they're not going to say, yes, sir, we'll do it, and we're going to do it because you told us to. That's a kind of a Washington, D.C. dream, in my view, a sort of a congressman's dream. It isn't going to happen. Whether or not the two sides can understand better the need for Chinese movement, and there is need for Chinese movement, remains to be seen, but it's not going to be an announcement at the end of this meeting.
Bob, it's John Ehrlichman. Obviously, both sides have a different view on the job story. And Premier Wen said yesterday a change in currency is not something that's going to change the unemployment rate story here in the United States, which raises the question, which Steve Roach of Morgan Stanley has been talking about. Outside of the currency, what about China's policies on things like the minimum wage? If Chinese have more money, spending more on products, that'll create more exports to China, create more jobs for the U.S. Is there any way that at a certain point the conversation can change to that topic, or are we just going to keep talking currency?
Well, as usual, Steve's on the right track. I mean, the big issue really is the so-called rebalancing of the Chinese economy, whereby the Chinese economic growth engine depends more on domestic consumption expanding more rapidly and less on exporting. Now, that's not something any government could do overnight, even an authoritarian government like China's. But Steve is right. That's where the action needs to be. That plus maintaining open markets for American and other international companies' products. There have been concerns from American businesses in the last year or two that the Chinese are beginning to look toward protecting their domestic industries at the expense of foreign industries and foreign companies and foreign products. Those issues need to be addressed very, very strongly. And any violations or clearly defined violations of WTO requirements on the part of China need to be prosecuted, as the Obama administration is doing. Those are the big issues. The currency is, to my mind, even though many people feel differently, is a side issue when it comes to U.S. Employment problems. And I think if you ask yourself, if we told the Chinese what to do and they did it, would we be able to say a year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now, thus we conclude that we've increased employment by this many jobs? I think that kind of measurement is improbable.
Yeah, it's improbable, and one country, of course, can't be a scapegoat. Bob, thanks so much for joining us. Bob Kapp joining us there. He's a former president of the United States-China Business Council.